This is lesson 2, semi-automatic pistols and their parts and their operations. But because this is Gun Safety 101, we're going to go back and look at the cardinal rules again. Cardinal rule number 1 is all guns are always loaded, and we always pretend they are. No matter what you're doing with a handgun, pretend and consider it loaded. Rule number 2 is do not point the muzzle at anything you do not wish to destroy. For those of you who don't know, the muzzle is this end of the gun where the bullet exits. When you have a gun in your hand, the muzzle is yours. You're controlling it. You don't point it at anything you do not want to destroy. Rule number 3, keep your finger off the trigger until you intend to fire. This is the condition of your trigger finger 98 to 99% of the time you have a gun in your hand. The time it takes for you to pull the trigger is a very brief moment in history. You pull the trigger once, twice, even if you fire 15 rounds out of your gun, it's going to be a really short period of time. Your finger comes out of the trigger guard and up on the frame of the gun. And by the way, this is the biggest safety that we all have, our trigger finger. And rule number 4, know your target, what's beyond it, what's next to it, what's in front of it. You're responsible for every round you fire. Make sure that what you are aiming at is in fact a target that you want to hit, and that whatever's behind it, if you do miss, your bullet will fall harmlessly and hopefully not hurt any other person besides the individual you're aiming at, if that person's a bad person. We don't like bad people. So, lesson 2, semi-automatic pistols and parts. A semi-automatic pistol fires a cartridge each time the trigger is pulled, automatically extracts and ejects the empty case and inserts a new cartridge into the chamber. The components or the parts of a semi-automatic, it has a frame, and on the frame are grips, usually composed of wood, rubber, molded plastic, that sit on the back frame of the gun. It has a trigger guard to protect the trigger from unintentional discharges. It has a rear sight used when aiming in assistance with the front sight to fire the gun. It has a back strap, which some are exposed, some are not. On modern firearms, most of them are not, because the back strap is in fact part of the grip itself. It has a safety, some do, some don't, a mechanical safety, but if your gun does have a mechanical safety like this 1911 right here, it is your responsibility to ensure that the safety is operating properly. They can fail. It's rare, but they can fail, and you're responsible for making sure that safety is operational. And they have a slide stop. I personally do not like to use the slide stop as a slide release. There are more convenient ways to allow the slide to move forward when you put it back into battery. And not only that, you've got metal against metal friction, and when you're using the slide stop as a slide release, you can wear out the parts of your gun a lot more rapidly than doing it in a different fashion. And they all have a barrel, metal tube through which the bullet passes, and it has a bore, which is the inside of the barrel. You don't need to worry about bores too much, just know that there is one. It has a single chamber, unlike a revolver, which can have multiple chambers, which will have multiple chambers. A pistol is going to have one chamber, and it's going to be connected to the barrel. It's going to have rifling, traditional or polygonal. Traditional rifling has lands and grooves, and polygonal rifling has hills and valleys, and they both impart a spin on the bullet. Traditional rifling will leave etch marks on the bullet itself, and that bullet can then be traced back to the gun because of that etching. Polygonal does not leave anything on the bullet at all. And it has a muzzle, like we talked about, rule number 2, muzzle, the front end of the gun where the bullet exits. You don't point the muzzle at anything you do not want to destroy. And they all have a caliber of some sort. And now all guns are going to have the caliber stamped on them somewhere on the gun or on the frame, and that will tell you what you need to use to feed that gun. I do have one gun up here, the Beretta, which is indicated as a 9 short, which is also the same thing as a 380, which is kind of interesting because you don't see too many guns calibered as 9 short, but the Beretta 86 is in fact calibered as a 9 short. It's going to have a trigger. When pulled, it activates the hammer or the firing pin or the striker fire, whichever type of gun you have. Some have hammers, some do not. Striker fire certainly do not. They're all going to have a slide. The slides can be full slides, they can be partial slides, but the slides operation is to retract, reload the gun. It's going to have an ejection port. The ejection port is a hole in the side of the slide, and for safety purposes, you really don't want to get any fleshy bits of your body inside the ejection port when the slide is closing, because it closes with a little bit of force, and it's a metal-to-metal connection. There will be blood, and you will have to go get a boo-boo cover for it. It's going to have an extractor, sometimes built into the side of the frame, sometimes not, but the extractor's job is to hook onto the empty case and pull it out of the chamber as the slide moves backwards, eject it out to the side, and give the give the gun an opportunity to put a new round in the chamber. Going to have a recoil spring, which you do not see. They are buried inside the slides. And it's going to have a guide rod in there too as well that goes around the spring, but you don't see that. It's going to have a magazine. These are magazines. These are not clips. Magazine, not a clip. And its purpose is to house the ammunition, whether it be 15 rounds like this. Some magazines have 6 rounds in them, 7 rounds, 8 rounds. They run the gamut all the way up to, you know, ARs up here, which have 30-round magazines. But they're magazines. They are not clips. Somewhere on the frame of the gun is going to be a magazine release button. They can be above the trigger guard, below the trigger guard, in line with the trigger guard. They can be on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, or both. But there will be some button on the handle of that gun to release the magazine. And mind you, all magazines in proper working order are spring release loaded. So if you hold the gun upside down, you mash the button, the magazine should pop out. If your gun's not doing that, you might want to have it looked at, but they're designed to actually be spring loaded for ejection purposes. Now, unlike a revolver, there's an extra operating system that we can get when we have pistols. We can get single action pistols, double action pistols, double single pistols, and striker fired. The first gun we're going to look at is a single action semi-automatic. Now we must make sure that this gun is safe and clear, so I'm going to go through the process of unloading it right now. The first thing we do is we eject the magazine. Magazine's out of the gun. Then we can cycle the slide a couple of times. 3 times is my preferred method. Then using the slide stop, we will lock the slide to the rear. We'll look inside the chamber. We will look down the magazine well, and if we can stick our pinky in there as well to ensure that this is out of the gun, and then we're going to look in the chamber one more time. And when you're doing this, please do it completely and thoroughly. Don't let somebody interrupt you while you're doing it, because it could end up in a really bad situation. When you're unloading a pistol, unload it all the way to ensure that it is unloaded. This gun has now been safety checked, but notice where my finger is. My finger's always going to be there. This is where your finger lives. Like I said earlier, 99, 89, 98, 80, 98% of the time. So this gun is completely unloaded. This is a single action pistol. The hammer on this gun is cocked right now. I'm going to release the hammer and let it go forward. Now, if there was a loaded round in this chamber, I can push on this trigger all day long, and the trigger will do nothing. The hammer has to be cocked for this trigger to work, because this trigger can do one single thing, and that is release the hammer. So for this gun to fire, the hammer has to be cocked. The trigger does not move, and then to pull the trigger, it takes very little pressure. The gun fires, and the slide cycles, reloads the gun, and cocks the hammer for me again. Gun goes bang, slide cycles, cocks the hammer for me. It'll do that every time until the gun runs out of rounds, and it will go into a condition called emergency slide lock, which is that. That's telling me that the magazine is empty, because there's a little spring indent in there that is not being affected by a round that's not in the magazine, so the gun is empty. But this is a single action only. This particular gun happens to be a 1911. For you gun aficionados, people that know, you'll know that 1911s are quality handguns. Now we're going to look at a small double action only. I have to make sure that this gun is clear, so I'm going to remove the magazine. I'm going to cycle the slide. I'm going to hold it back. This does not have a slide stop on it. I'm going to look in the chamber. I'm going to look into the magazine well. I'm going to put my finger in the magazine well, and I'm going to go look back at the chamber. This gun is unloaded. This gun has a hammer, but we have no physical access to it. So every time we pull the trigger on this gun, we have to pull the pull the trigger to cock the hammer. Again, we have no access to it. The hammer is pulled, the trigger is pulled, the hammer is cocked back, the gun goes bang, the slide cycles, and the hammer is forward again, so it's going to have to be cocked with your trigger and then released with your trigger. So this gun is always fired with a double action trigger. This trigger has to cock and release the hammer. Now we're going to look at a gun that is a double action, single action. The waters get a little muddy with these because each manufacturer has different things that they put on their double singles. So first I'm going to remove the magazine. Caught that, didn't I? Cycle the slide, lock the slide to the rear. I'm going to look in the chamber. I'm going to look in the magazine well, and I'm going to look in the chamber. And when I look in the chamber, I'm looking for brass. I want to see no brass. I want to see nothing. We've got a double action trigger right now. The safety is off. Red means dead. Safety is off. If you see red, you're definitely off. I'm cocking the hammer with my trigger finger right now. The gun goes bang. The slide cycles, cocks the hammer for me, and now the gun is in single action mode, and the trigger has moved to the rear of the trigger guard. Much less physical pressure to pull the trigger. The gun goes bang. The slide cycles, cocks the hammer for me. It'll do that every single consecutive round after that until I engage the safety, which is a hammer drop safety. Now the gun is in safe. If I want to shoot this gun again, I have to disengage the safety, and now I am back to a double action trigger. Now the fourth platform that runs today in the modern firearm world are striker fires. So we're going to clear this gun. If you all remember how to do this, I'm going to remove the magazine. I'm going to cycle the slide 2 or 3 times. Then I'm going to use the slide stop, and I'm going to lock the slide to the rear. I'm going to look in the chamber, make sure there's nothing in there, stick my finger in the magazine well, look down the magazine well, and look back into the chamber, and the gun is cleared. This is a striker fire gun. It has no hammer. It does have a firing pin, but it's called a striker, and right now the striker is at rest away from the round. If there was a round in this chamber, I believe these are considered double action guns, by the way, but right now when I pull that trigger a little bit, it's moving the striker back just a shade. The gun fires, the slide cycles, magazine's in it, slide cycles, and the gun's ready to go again. Let me get that magazine out so we can do that better. So the gun fires, cycles, fires, cycles, fires, cycles. Let's go back real quickly to the safeties on these guns. This is a Glock 19, so the only safety on this gun is a split trigger. So if I try to push on the side of that trigger, the gun's not going to fire. I have to take up that little bit of trigger in the middle of the split trigger. As I said, this gun has a hammer drop safety. This little guy here has no safeties on it whatsoever, which is fine when it comes to self-defense. You do not want to be messing with buttons and all sorts of other things. A 1911 has a back strap safety and a paddle safety. This particular safety on this gun is ambidextrous, so I can do it with my right thumb or my left thumb, depending on which hand I had it in. But the back strap safety must be engaged, and it's simply done with a grip. When you have a round in the chamber, and this gun is fired, the energy from the round will push the slide to the rear, eject the empty round that just left, and pick up a round off the magazine, load the gun, and then when it's fired again, the brass comes out. Typically with a lot more force than that, because it was a live round that was just fired. They all pretty much operate the same way. The slide cycles, the gun's fired, it picks up a round off the top of the magazine, and it repeats that over and over and over. You don't have to do anything to the gun until the magazine is empty. Then you either have to replace the magazine or reload this one and put the magazine back in the gun. Earlier I talked to you about the fact that some people like to use slide stops as opposed to... Some people will just at some point just mash on that button, but you don't have to do that. All you have to do is grip the gun here, pull back, let it go, and the gun is loaded. As you can see, that round came out. As I said earlier, this slide stop finds that little slot in the metal, and when it's in the locked position, the slide wants to move that way. The slide stop says, no, 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 you can't do that. But when you pull back, the slide stop is spring loaded to drop down out of the way, and the slide can move forward. That is my reasoning for not doing that. Plus, actually, with this gun, if I was carrying this gun, I cannot reach the slide stop with my thumb without losing my master firing grip. So I can just do that. All right, we're going to load these guys. We're going to load this 1911. We're going to take a magazine and we're going to place it in our left hand with the flat part of the magazine to our palm. We're going to pick up 8 rounds because this is an 8-round magazine. I would suggest you practice doing this with a fistful of rounds because you never know what's going to need to be done. These 2 metal bent pieces hold the rounds in, so you must insert the round ahead of those and push them in. This part right here is called the traveler. So it goes in behind it. This takes 8 rounds, so you just keep loading them until it's fully loaded, and then you're done. The more rounds in the magazine, the more difficult it will become. All right, for those of you that lack the hand strength and or just the desire to load a magazine like this, 1 round at a time, the Lapula, is that how you say it? Uplula is an assister. So you take this, you place it over the magazine, you push down while it's squeezed, release it, lift it up, squeeze it, insert the round, lift it up, squeeze it, and there's 15 rounds into a magazine with no real effort. And when you're going to dump your magazines, by the way, if you hold them like this, put them in your right hand, put the rounds down, and just simply drag them into the palm of your hand, they won't go flying all over the place, because if you don't, they just kind of like pop up in the air and bounce all over the place. 15 rounds, very little effort, just takes a little bit more time. I know I could load this by hand faster than I can with this, just simply because I've loaded by hand. I don't particularly like using these, but I will if need be. So there you go. So I'm going to load this gun to a +1 condition. So I'm going to take this full magazine, insert it into the magazine well. I'm going to rack the slide, re-engage the safety on this gun, take the magazine out, put the extra round in the top of the magazine, and reinsert the magazine into the gun. Now we know that just happened. It loaded a round because we could not put that extra round in the magazine if it hadn't. But under normal conditions, we always do a thing called a press check, which is bring the gun back, pull it back maybe a ½ inch or so, make sure that you've got brass in the gun, and give it a little tap to make sure it went back into battery. And this gun is loaded to capacity. We can talk later about the fact that this gun is loaded, safety on, hammer cocked. It's called condition 1 for a 1911. Most people that carry concealed carry in a condition very close to condition 1. This gun here is one of my carry guns. When I carry it fully loaded with a round in the chamber. If you all know what I'm doing, remember I just safety checked it. This magazine has a fake round in it, so if I was just doing that, then I would just give it a quick press check to make sure there was brass in it. It's not uncommon to pull your gun up, go to shoot it, and it goes click. You forgot to put a round into the chamber, so always try to get into the habit of every time you load your gun, do a quick press check to make sure that it actually picked up a round, because if the magazine is not fully inserted into the magazine well, it won't pick up a round off the magazine. If you shoot enough, you will eventually understand that you can hear what it sounds like when there's a round being stripped off the top of your magazine and inserted into the chamber. It's definitely a sound that you will recognize over time, but press check anyways. So that's how we load them. Now you can practice that over and over and over. As you saw, I use dummy rounds. You don't want to use live rounds to practice that if you can avoid it. But you can buy these online. They're relatively inexpensive. I have them for all caliber guns that I have. They're good for practice. They're good for a bunch of stuff. They're good for this class, obviously, and they're relatively inexpensive. But you saw them earlier with the revolvers. Always have some dummy rounds, and we'll talk about more what you can do with dummy rounds on a live range. Loading a double action versus a single action versus a striker fire, they're pretty much all the same thing. Is load the magazine, put it into the gun, cycle the slide. Now if you want to load it to +1 capacity, pull the magazine back out, put a new round in the top of the magazine so the magazine's topped off and there's a round in the chamber. The decocking of these, unlike revolvers, is very different. I would read the book that you got with your pistol and how to decock it. Like this little gun here, every time you pull the trigger, it decocks itself. It's never cocked. This one here requires me to do this with 2 hands, unlike a revolver, which I can do with pretty much 1 hand. But this gun, because of the back strap safety, I must in fact use 2 hands. And we do it the same way that we did the revolvers. We get a hold of the hammer, pull the trigger, let the hammer go forward, get our finger off the trigger, and let the safety mechanism inside do their thing. Striker fire guns are always decocked. Every time you pull the trigger, it's like a double action to a degree. Every time you pull the trigger, the gun cycles, the gun goes bang, and it decocks itself. But it's ready. That's why there's kind of a little confusion in the gun world whether this is a double action or a single action. It acts just like a single action gun, but when you pull the trigger, the striker moves back just a little bit, and that's what categorizes it, as far as I know, as a double action. These guys have a lot of moving parts, so they have a tendency to malfunction considerably more than a revolver would, but that's okay. You just need to learn how to reproduce those malfunctions with dummy ammo in a safe environment so you can practice clearing them. So the first thing you can have, you point the gun, you pull the trigger, nothing happens, it goes click. So what you do in the pistol world is you do a thing called tap and rack. So I got the gun here, I pull the trigger, it goes click. Just tap the magazine, rack the slide. If something comes out like it just did, doesn't matter. If nothing comes out, that's not the point. What happened was nothing happened when you pulled the trigger. So tap the magazine, rack the slide, put a fresh round in front of the hammer, and the gun should go bang. Failure to feed or stovepipe. That stovepipes are pretty self-explanatory. I have to set this gun up for just a second for a stovepipe. But stovepipes are pretty self-explanatory. This is what a stovepipe looks like. Oddly enough, it looks like a stovepipe. Now, if you've got rounds in your magazine below the stovepipe, typically what happens is if you pull the slide to the rear, the round coming out of the magazine pushes the stovepipe out of the way and it just falls to the ground. If that doesn't happen, you can just tip the gun and fix the stovepipe. Pretty simple thing to fix, not a big deal. But why did your gun stovepipe? Sometimes the reason you get stovepipes is because there wasn't enough gunpowder or enough energy, something went wrong with the round, that the slide didn't cycle all the way, and before the ejector could chuck that empty piece of brass out, the slide came back down on top of that vertical round of stovepipe. So if you do start stovepiping a lot, you need to have things looked at by a gunsmith. Failure to feed. Once again, pretty much anytime your semi-automatic goes click, you can tap, you can rack it, and again, it doesn't matter if anything came out or not, you're just trying to put a fresh round in front of it. So failure to extract could be a couple of different things. I don't know if y'all can see this, but this particular piece of brass does not have a head rim on it. So this is the case without the rim. This is the case with the rim on it. This is where the extractor grabs on the case rim. So this round went bang, but there was nothing for the extractor to grab to eject it from the chamber. So I had to unload the gun and push it backwards through the chamber with a pencil. So check your ammo, in particular your self-defense ammo, to make sure that it is of good quality and that all the parts are connected to it. The other reason that you could fail to extract is you could have a bad extractor. Again, on this 1911, that black portion right there is the extractor. It's just a little hook that hooks onto the round and snatches it out of the chamber. If that gets worn out or broken or something to that nature, it's just not going to be able to pull the brass out. Now, the worst thing that can happen, in my opinion, to a semi-automatic is a double feed. So now I have cycled the slide. There's a round in the chamber and there's a round in the magazine trying to occupy the same space as the other round. As I told you earlier, magazines are spring loaded, and when you press the magazine release button, it should jump out. This magazine is jammed in the gun. So I must use the slide stop, lock it to the rear manually, remove the magazine, cycle the slide, eject that round, reinsert the magazine, and reload the gun. And the double feed is fixed. But if you have a double feed and you're in a dangerous situation, you're probably going to want to fix that double feed from behind cover, because it takes a little bit of time to fix them. Now, there is one thing I want to back up on real quick, and that is loading the magazine into these guns. I'm going to use this magazine because it's the longest magazine I have, and I have regular sized hands. There's nothing extraordinarily large or small about my hands, but I can do this all day long with the biggest magazine that I have. If I place the base of the magazine to the lower portion of my palm, put my fingertip, my index finger, on the top round, I can load this magazine without looking at the gun. I can just push it home with one shot. What you see a lot of people do, especially on TV, is they do that, then they do that. In a gunfight or just regular practice, that's a waste of time taking your hand off of it. This is much more efficient, and you can do this without looking at the gun because you're allowing your fingertip to communicate with your brain where this magazine well is and the direction of the magazine well and everything. You just go in there and just pop the magazine right into the gun. So practice doing that at home. Practice with dummy rounds, of course, but all you gotta do is put your finger on the trigger and it'll go into the magazine every time. But you must understand that your finger is telling your brain where it is in space. So trust that.